There is a cut of beef sitting in the grocery case right now that most people walk past without a second look. It is not ribeye. It does not have the fancy label. It may not even look particularly impressive in the package. But handled correctly, that inexpensive piece of beef can come off your grill with a dark crust, deep flavor, and a tenderness that makes people ask what you paid for it. And here is the part that matters. You do not need an expensive bottle of marinade. You do not need a drawer full of powders. You do not need an electric tenderizer punching holes through the meat. What you need is a better understanding of what that piece of beef is actually doing. I learned that lesson the old-fashioned way, standing behind a meat counter and watching experienced cutters work with the parts of the animal most shoppers ignored. The expensive cuts were easy. Anyone can put a well-marbled ribeye over a hot fire and get a good meal. The real skill was taking something cheaper and getting the most out of it. That is where this method comes in. The first thing you need to understand is that toughness does not automatically mean poor quality. It usually means the muscle worked harder. Think about the animal as it lived. Some muscles barely moved. Others were working every day to support, walk, climb, and carry the animal. Those working muscles develop stronger connective tissue and thicker bundles of muscle fibers. That is why two steaks from the same animal can have completely different textures and completely different prices. The ribeye gets a lot of attention because the muscle itself is naturally tender and often heavily marbled. But there are cheaper cuts sitting surprisingly close to that same area of the animal that can give you a much better value if you know what you are looking for. One of my favorites is chuck eye. It is close to the rib section and can have the kind of beefy character people associate with a ribeye, but it usually costs considerably less. Then there is flat iron. For years, people overlooked it because of the connective tissue running through the center. Once butchers learned how to separate that structure properly, it became one of the most useful, inexpensive cuts around. Denver steak is another one worth knowing. And then you have sirloin, which is where things get especially interesting. Sirloin has plenty of flavor, but it is not naturally as forgiving as a heavily marbled ribeye. That makes it a better test. If your method can improve a leaner, harder working steak without turning it mushy or masking the flavor of the beef, you know you are doing something useful. Now we get to the technique, and this is where most people make their first mistake. They think tenderizing means attacking the meat. They reach for a fork. They grab a mallet. They buy a needle tenderizer. They pour something extremely acidic over the steak and hope time will do the rest. Sometimes those methods have their place, but they can also create a completely different problem. You can damage the outside of a steak long before you have meaningfully changed the center. That is why I prefer a slower approach. You are not trying to destroy the meat. You are trying to improve the part of it that actually needs help. One old method I learned about uses something most people already have in the kitchen: coffee. Not coffee grounds rubbed onto the steak, not some sweet coffee-flavored barbecue sauce, and definitely not a pile of flavored instant coffee. I am talking about strong brewed coffee used as part of a controlled soak. The idea sounds strange until you understand what you are trying to accomplish. Coffee is mildly acidic, but it is much gentler than the aggressive acids people commonly use in marinades. Vinegar and citrus can change the surface of meat quickly. That can be useful when carefully controlled, but leave them working too long and the outside can develop an unpleasant texture. Pineapple and papaya are another story because they contain enzymes that can break down proteins much more aggressively. That is why leaving a steak in a powerful enzymatic marinade overnight can give you something that is technically softer, but no longer pleasant to eat. The goal is not simply maximum breakdown. The goal is controlled improvement. That distinction matters. A good steak should still feel like steak. So here is how I approach it. Start with a strong dark roast coffee. Brew it stronger than you would normally drink it. Do not flavor it. No vanilla, no caramel, no hazelnut, nothing that turns your marinade into a dessert. Let the coffee cool completely. Cold is important. You are working with raw beef, so you do not want warm liquid sitting around the meat while you are preparing dinner. For every 2 cups of strong coffee, use roughly 1 tablespoon of kosher salt. Stir until the salt is completely dissolved. Now you have 2 things working together. The coffee provides the liquid environment, while the salt does something much more important than most people realize. Salt helps with seasoning and moisture retention, and unlike many marinade ingredients, it does not need to completely travel through the steak to make a noticeable difference. That brings me to one of the biggest myths in steak cooking. A marinade does not magically travel all the way through a thick steak. It does not matter whether you leave it for 4 hours or 40. The surface is where most of the direct marinade action happens, and that is perfectly fine, because the first bite starts at the surface. Your teeth hit the outside first. Your brain gets its first impression from the crust, seasoning, surface texture, and initial tenderness. So we are not trying to turn the entire steak into something else. We are improving the outside while allowing the salt and cooking process to do their own work. Put your steaks into a glass dish or a food-safe bag and pour the chilled coffee mixture over them. Make sure the meat is properly covered. If you are using a bag, remove as much excess air as practical before sealing it. Then put the whole thing into the refrigerator. For a thinner steak, a few hours can be enough to make the process worthwhile. For a thicker cut, I prefer an overnight window. Around 8 to 12 hours is a useful target. I would not treat longer as automatically better. More time does not mean more tenderness forever. Eventually, the surface can lose the character you actually want. This is one of those techniques where patience helps, but excess patience does not. Now comes the step that people constantly underestimate. Dry the steak, and I mean really dry it. When you take that steak out of the coffee mixture, it is going to be wet. That is expected. But if you throw it directly onto a hot grill, all that surface moisture has to go somewhere. The heat starts evaporating water instead of concentrating on browning the outside. And that is how you end up with a gray surface when what you wanted was a dark, deeply browned crust. Take paper towels and press the steak dry, top, bottom, edges. Do not rush this part. You have already spent hours preparing the meat. Do not throw away the benefit in 30 seconds because you were too impatient to dry it. Once it is dry, place it on a rack and put it back into the refrigerator uncovered for a short period. About 45 minutes is a good working window. The circulating cold air helps dry the exterior even further. That dry surface is exactly what you want when the steak meets the heat. This is where a lot of home cooks think they need more seasoning. You actually need less. Remember, the steak has already spent time with salt. So when you season it before cooking, use a lighter hand than you normally would. A little coarse black pepper is fine. Garlic can work too. But do not bury the beef under 12 different ingredients. If you need a pile of seasoning to make the steak taste like something, you may be covering up the very thing you spent all that time trying to improve. Now we get to the second half of the method, because tenderizing is only half the battle. A cheap steak can be softened and still taste lean. That is where fat comes in, and this is something expensive steaks get for free. Marbling. Those little threads of fat running through the muscle slowly melt as the steak cooks. They add richness and help create the sensation people associate with premium beef. A lean steak does not have the same built-in advantage, so you have to work with what you have. One of the most useful things you can ask your butcher for is beef fat trim. Not a complicated specialty ingredient, just clean beef fat that has been trimmed away while cutting other pieces. Depending on the shop, you may be able to get it for very little. Take that fat home and render it slowly. Put it into a pan over very low heat. Do not rush it. You are not trying to fry it. You are slowly melting the fat until you are left with clear rendered beef fat. Strain it and store it properly in the refrigerator. Now you have something incredibly useful, tallow, and you can use a small amount to give lean beef the richness it naturally lacks. You are not creating marbling inside the muscle. Nothing can do that. That is an important distinction. You are simply adding fat where it can actually contribute during the final stages of cooking. About a tablespoon is plenty for a couple of steaks, depending on their size. You do not need to drown the meat. The idea is to add richness, not turn your steak into a grease sponge. Now we can talk about the fire. This is where I see another common mistake. People put the steak directly over screaming hot heat and leave it there from beginning to end. That can work beautifully with certain thin cuts, but thicker working muscle steaks often benefit from a more controlled approach. I like a two-zone fire. Put your heat on one side of the grill and leave the other side without direct flame. That gives you two different cooking environments. You have a gentler area where the steak can gradually warm, and you have a hotter area where you can build the crust at the end. Start the steak on the cooler side, let the center come up gradually. You are giving the meat time to warm without immediately forcing the outside into an aggressive cooking environment. For a thicker steak, you can begin watching the internal temperature once it gets close to the range you want. A reliable instant read thermometer is one of the cheapest pieces of equipment you can own if you cook steak regularly. You do not need an expensive brand. You need a thermometer that gives you a dependable reading, because guessing is how good meat gets overcooked. For medium rare, many cooks aim to remove the steak somewhere around 130 to 135 degrees Fahrenheit, depending on the thickness and how much additional temperature rise they expect during resting. The exact number matters less than understanding the process. The steak will continue cooking after you remove it from the heat. So if you wait until it reaches your final target while it is still sitting over the fire, you can easily end up past that target by the time you sit down to eat. Once the steak reaches the appropriate temperature on the gentle side, move it directly over the hot coals or burner. Now you are no longer trying to cook the center, you are building the crust. This should happen quickly. Turn the steak as needed and give both sides enough heat to develop deep browning without burning the exterior. And this is where that coffee preparation starts making sense. You have a dry surface, you have controlled seasoning, you have the concentrated compounds from the coffee, and now you have high heat. That combination can produce a much deeper crust than simply putting a wet steak onto the grill. Near the end of cooking, add your rendered beef fat. A small spoonful over the steak while it finishes can help coat the surface and add another layer of richness. You do not need to do this for the entire cooking time. In fact, I prefer not to. Adding fat right at the end gives you the benefit without allowing it to dominate the entire cooking process. Then take the steak off the heat and leave it alone. Give it around 10 minutes to rest. Do not immediately cut into it because you are hungry. You just spent hours preparing this piece of meat. 10 minutes is not going to ruin your evening. And please do not wrap it tightly in foil if you just worked hard to build a crust. Trapping steam around the steak can soften that beautiful exterior. Let it rest uncovered. Then comes the final mistake, the knife. I have watched people spend all afternoon cooking a steak correctly and destroy the eating experience in less than a minute by slicing it the wrong way. Look closely at the meat. Find the direction of the muscle fibers. You should be able to see lines running through the steak. Those lines are the grain. Your knife should cross them, not travel alongside them. When you cut across the grain, you shorten those long muscle fibers before they reach your mouth. That makes the steak easier to chew. If you cut with the grain, you are essentially handing your teeth long strands of muscle and asking them to do the work your knife should have done. This matters even more with cheaper working muscle cuts. And there is another detail people miss. The grain can change direction, especially with certain sirloin and shoulder cuts. So do not assume you can slice the entire steak in one direction just because the first half looked that way. Follow the fibers. Turn the steak if necessary, then continue cutting across them. That one small habit can make a surprisingly large difference. Now let's talk honestly about what this method can and cannot do. It cannot turn sirloin into ribeye. It cannot create marbling where there was none. It cannot transform every cheap cut into a premium steak. Anyone who tells you otherwise is selling you something. What it can do is close part of the gap, and that is where the real value is. You are taking a cut that was cheaper because the muscle worked harder, then using preparation, moisture control, seasoning, fat, temperature management, and slicing technique to make the most of what is already there. That is very different from pretending the cut is something it is not. And that honesty is important. A ribeye is still a ribeye. If you want the buttery richness of heavily marbled beef, there is no shortcut that completely replaces it. But if your goal is a great steak on a normal grocery budget, you do not have to start at the most expensive end of the meat case. That is the lesson I wish more people understood. The expensive part of the animal is expensive partly because everyone wants the same thing. The cheaper parts are not necessarily bad. They are simply less forgiving. And less forgiving meat rewards technique. That is exactly why butchers have always paid attention to these cuts. We cannot afford to treat every piece of beef like it is interchangeable. We know where the muscle came from. We know how hard it worked. We know which direction the fibers run. And we know what happens when you cook it too aggressively. You start seeing meat differently once you understand that. You stop looking at the price tag first. You start looking at the cut. You start asking the butcher questions. What part of the animal did this come from? How thick is it? Where is the grain running? Does this particular cut need slower cooking? Can I get some beef fat trim? Those questions can save you more money than another expensive bottle of marinade ever will. And if you are shopping on a budget, look beyond the familiar names: chuck eye, flat iron, Denver, top sirloin, some flank and skirt cuts. Each one has its own personality. Some want high heat and a fast cook. Some benefit from slower treatment. Some absolutely demand thin slicing across the grain. There is no universal trick that fixes every steak. That is another lesson worth remembering. The cut tells you what to do. Do not fight the anatomy. Work with it. If you are cooking something thin and strongly flavored, you may want a fast, hot cook. If you have a thicker working muscle, controlled heat can be much more forgiving. If the steak is lean, adding a little beef fat near the end can provide richness. If the grain is obvious, respect it when you slice. The technique follows the meat. That is the part people often miss. And once you understand that, expensive beef starts looking a little different. You realize you are not necessarily paying for better beef. Sometimes you are paying for a more forgiving piece of beef. That is a meaningful difference. A forgiving steak lets you make mistakes. A cheaper cut forces you to understand what you are doing. And once you learn that, the cheaper cut becomes much more useful. So if you want to try this yourself, keep the first experiment simple. Pick up a good chuck eye or sirloin. Make strong unflavored coffee and chill it completely. For every 2 cups, add about 1 tablespoon of kosher salt. Keep the steak refrigerated while it soaks. Give it several hours, with an overnight window being a practical target for a thicker steak. Remove it and dry it thoroughly. Then place it uncovered on a rack in the refrigerator for roughly 45 minutes. Build a 2-zone fire. Warm the steak gradually on the cooler side. Finish it over high heat. Use a thermometer instead of guessing. If the steak is lean, add a modest amount of rendered beef fat near the end. Let it rest for about 10 minutes. Then find the grain and slice across it. And most importantly, taste the meat honestly. Do not ask whether it tastes exactly like a ribeye. Ask whether you would buy it again. Ask whether your family would notice that you spent considerably less. Ask whether the crust is better, whether the texture improved, and whether the beef still tastes like beef. That is the test that matters, and if you try it, tell me what cut you used and what it cost where you live. Beef prices can vary dramatically from one place to another, and the best bargain in one town may not be the same cut in another. There is a whole other side of this subject that most home cooks never explore: dry aging, not the complicated restaurant version. The basic principles that allow beef to lose moisture, concentrate flavor, and develop a completely different character over time. But that method has one critical weakness. One mistake in temperature, airflow, moisture, or cleanliness can ruin the entire piece. And knowing exactly what that mistake looks like before you begin is far more important than simply knowing how many days to wait. That is where butcher knowledge becomes more useful than another recipe. Because good beef does not always need more money, sometimes it needs more understanding. And there is one more thing worth understanding before you start experimenting with cheaper beef. Not every tough steak needs to be tenderized. Sometimes the biggest problem is that the wrong cut was chosen for the cooking method in the first place. A working muscle that has a lot of connective tissue is not necessarily asking you for a marinade. It may be asking you for time and low heat. That distinction can save you from ruining a perfectly good piece of meat. Take a cut like chuck. If you treat it like a thin steak and throw it over screaming hot heat until the center reaches medium, you are going to be disappointed. But put that same muscle into a slower cooking environment and give the connective tissue enough time to soften, and suddenly you are dealing with a completely different piece of beef. That is why I always tell people to stop asking, what is the best steak? Ask a better question. What is the best way to cook this particular muscle? That question will save you money, and it will save you a lot of bad dinners. There is another simple test I use when I am standing in front of a meat case. Look at the grain. If you can see long, obvious fibers running through the steak, pay attention. That tells you something about how the meat is going to eat. A steak with pronounced grain is going to punish you more severely if you slice it incorrectly. A heavily marbled steak can sometimes hide mistakes because the fat softens the eating experience. Lean beef has nowhere to hide. That is why cutting technique becomes part of the cooking method. People think cooking ends when the steak leaves the grill. It doesn't. It ends when the knife has done its job. And there is another trick that costs almost nothing. Do not slice the steak immediately after cooking unless you absolutely have to. Let it settle. The internal juices are moving around while the meat is hot. Give it time to calm down. Then use a sharp knife, not a serrated table knife, not the dull knife you use to open cardboard boxes, a properly sharpened kitchen knife. Make clean cuts. Keep them reasonably thin when you are dealing with a tougher working muscle. That way the final bite is not fighting against you. This is one of those things that sounds almost too simple to matter, but simplicity is often what makes butcher techniques useful. You do not need 20 ingredients. You need to understand what the meat needs. There is also a mistake I want you to avoid with coffee. Do not assume that stronger coffee automatically means better results. You want a concentrated brew, but you are not trying to create an industrial strength chemical bath. The coffee is there as part of the process. It should not overpower the natural flavor of the beef. That is why I prefer plain dark roast rather than flavored coffee. You are building a steak, not making a coffee-flavored piece of jerky. And remember that the coffee is only one part of the equation. If you skip the drying step, you lose one of the biggest advantages. If you overcook the steak, the marinade cannot rescue it. If you slice with the grain, tenderness suffers. If you use a cut that really needs braising, no amount of surface treatment will turn it into a naturally tender steak. That is the honest version. There is no magic liquid. There is no secret ingredient that bypasses the anatomy of beef. There are only techniques that work with the meat instead of against it. And once you start thinking that way, the grocery store becomes a different place. You begin noticing cuts that you previously ignored. You see the shoulder section and realize it contains more possibilities than ground beef. You look at sirloin and start thinking about how the grain runs. You see flat iron and understand why the butcher had to separate it a certain way. You see chuck eye and realize that the name on the package is not telling you the whole story. That is the knowledge worth taking home. Because food prices are not something most families can simply ignore. You can either spend more money on the same cuts everyone else is chasing, or you can become better at using the animal. Butchers have been doing the second one for generations. And the funny thing is, the techniques are usually not complicated. They are just specific. Dry the meat, control the salt, Control the temperature. Use the right cooking method. Respect the grain. Do not overcook it. And learn what the muscle was designed to do. That is how you make cheaper beef work harder for you. The next time you stand in front of the meat case, do not automatically reach for the package with the highest price. Look at the less popular cuts, ask questions, take one home, and give it the treatment it actually needs. You might discover that the steak you thought you could no longer afford was never the only good steak in the case. Sometimes the better bargain is sitting 3 shelves away, waiting for somebody who knows what they are looking at. And once you learn that, you stop shopping for labels. You start shopping for muscles. That is when cheap beef gets